The sun bathed the picturesque suburban neighborhood in a golden glow, illuminating the meticulously manicured lawns and pastel-painted houses that lined Maplewood Avenue. Birds chirped melodiously, and sprinklers hummed rhythmically, creating a serene ambience. Yet, beneath this tranquil facade, tensions simmered just below the surface. Marcus, a 32-year-old software engineer, had moved into the neighborhood only a month ago. With his sharp features, calm demeanor, and penchant for vintage cars, he exuded an air of quiet confidence. On this particular Saturday morning, he was in his driveway, crouched under the hood of his refurbished cherry-red Mustang. Tools clinked as he worked, his hands skillfully navigating the car's intricate machinery. For Marcus, this wasn't just a pastime. It was a connection to his late father, who had taught him everything he knew about cars. Across the street, behind lace curtains, Howard Reeves watched intently. A man in his mid-50s, Howard had a perpetually furrowed brow and a self-appointed sense of authority over the neighborhood. Known as Male Karen to the residents, a title he wore with unwitting pride, Howard was notorious for his obsessive enforcement of HOA rules. From flagpole heights to mailbox colors, no detail escaped his scrutiny. Howard's eyes narrowed as he observed Marcus. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He had already convinced himself that Marcus didn't belong here. The Mustang, though pristine, seemed too loud for the neighborhood. And Marcus? Howard didn't like the way he carried himself, as if he had every right to be there. Doesn't he know the kind of standards we maintain here? Howard muttered to himself, his fingers curling around his coffee mug. Unable to contain himself, Howard marched out of his house, his slippers slapping against the pavement. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, his presence disrupting the quiet morning. Marcus glanced up as Howard approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Excuse me," Howard began, his tone sharp. "What exactly are you doing here?" Marcus straightened, his expression neutral. "Good morning. I'm working on my car. Is there a problem?" Howard crossed his arms, his gaze flitting between Marcus and the Mustang. "We have rules in this neighborhood," he said, his voice rising. "No unsightly activities in the driveway. It lowers the property values." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Unsightly? I'm just maintaining my car. It's not against the rules." "Well, I don't recall seeing you at any HOA meetings," Howard retorted. "Do you even live here?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unspoken in its implications. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "Yes, I live here. I bought this house last month. If you'd like, I can show you my deed." Howard waved a dismissive hand. "That won't be necessary. I just think it's odd, that's all. People here have a certain way of doing things. You might want to fit in better." Marcus took a deliberate step forward, meeting Howard's gaze. "I appreciate the advice," he said evenly, "but I'm not breaking any rules, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to get back to my car." Howard bristled at Marcus's calm defiance. "We'll see about that," he snapped, turning on his heel. "I'll be calling the HOA. Let's see how long this nonsense lasts." As Howard stormed away, Marcus sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. He wasn't a stranger to encounters like this, but it didn't make them any less exhausting. The neighborhood had seemed perfect on paper, quiet, safe, and welcoming. But reality, as always, was more complicated. Howard returned to his house, slamming the door behind him. He immediately picked up the phone, dialing the HOA representative. "Caldwell." He barked into the receiver, "We've got a situation on Maplewood. There's a new resident causing trouble. You need to come down here right away." From his window, Howard watched Marcus continue working on his car, seemingly unfazed. Yet, deep down, Howard felt a flicker of unease. For the first time, his authority had been challenged, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. Back in the driveway, Marcus tightened a bolt and stepped back to admire his work. The Mustang gleamed under the morning sun, a symbol of resilience and hard work. He had no idea what the coming hours would bring, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let anyone dictate his place in the neighborhood. As the day unfolded, The quiet on Maplewood Avenue would give way to an explosive confrontation, one that would expose the fragile veneer of harmony and force everyone to confront the biases lurking in the shadows. The section ends with tension, leaving readers eager to know what happens when the HOA gets involved and how Marcus navigates the brewing storm. The peaceful rhythm of Maplewood Avenue broke as Mr. Caldwell, the HOA officer, pulled into the neighborhood in his understated gray sedan. Known for his even-handed approach, Caldwell had dealt with Howard's complaints before and was already skeptical of the urgency Howard claimed in his call. Stepping out of the car, his tailored navy suit and clipboard in hand signaled both professionalism and preparedness. Howard was waiting on his porch, arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk curling his lips. "About time," he muttered as Caldwell approached. "What seems to be the issue, Mr. Reeves?" Caldwell asked, his tone neutral but tinged with weariness. Howard gestured grandly toward Marcus's house. "That man has been working on his car in the driveway all morning. It's unsightly, loud, and against HOA regulations." Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "Working on a car? That doesn't inherently violate any rules, Howard." "Well, I'm sure you'll find something," Howard insisted, his voice sharpening. "It's not just the car. It's about the kind of people we're letting into this neighborhood. Standards are slipping, Caldwell. You know it as well as I do." Caldwell didn't respond, but the subtle tightening of his jaw revealed his irritation. Without another word, he walked toward Marcus's house. Marcus was still in the driveway, wiping his hands on a rag as Caldwell approached. The sunlight glinted off the Mustang's freshly polished hood, a testament to Marcus's hard work and attention to detail. "Good afternoon," Caldwell began, his tone measured. "I'm Mr. Caldwell, the HOA officer. I received a complaint regarding your activities here." Marcus turned, his expression polite but guarded. "Afternoon. What seems to be the problem?" Caldwell glanced around. The car was spotless, the tools neatly arranged, and the driveway free of oil stains or clutter. "It appears Mr. Reeves has concerns about you working on your vehicle in the driveway. However, I don't see any immediate violations." Howard, who had followed at a distance, interjected loudly, "Of course you don't. That's because you're not looking hard enough." Marcus took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. "I'm not breaking any rules," he said, addressing both Caldwell and Howard. "I read the HOA guidelines when I moved in. Working on personal property is allowed as long as it doesn't create a disturbance or mess." Caldwell nodded, impressed by Marcus's preparedness. "That's correct," he confirmed. Howard's face reddened. "Disturbance? What do you call the noise of that engine? And the sight of a garage mechanic setup in plain view?" He gestured wildly toward the tools. "This is a respectable neighborhood, not some car lot." Marcus turned to face Howard fully, his calm demeanor unwavering. "With all due respect, sir, I'm maintaining my property, something any homeowner would do. My work isn't disturbing anyone else, and it's certainly not against the rules." Howard's voice rose. "You don't belong here. People like you think you can just show up and do whatever you want." The implication behind his words was clear, and the air grew heavy with tension. Caldwell glanced at Marcus, his expression apologetic but helpless. "Mr. Reeves," Caldwell said firmly, "I've reviewed the situation, and there's no violation here. Marcus is well within his rights as a homeowner." "That's ridiculous," Howard snapped, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're letting him get away with ruining this neighborhood." Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This isn't about the rules, is it, Howard? It's about me. You've decided I don't fit into your narrow idea of who belongs here, and you're using the HOA to try to push me out." Howard opened his mouth to retort but faltered, his indignation momentarily overshadowed by surprise at Marcus's boldness. Caldwell cleared his throat, stepping between the two men. "That's enough," he said firmly. "I won't tolerate personal attacks. This is a community, and we all need to treat each other with respect. Marcus has done nothing wrong, and this matter is closed." Howard's face darkened, but he said nothing more. Caldwell turned to Marcus, offering a small nod. "If you have any further concerns, feel free to reach out to me directly," he said before walking back to his car. As Caldwell drove away, Marcus met Howard's glare with quiet defiance. "I moved here because I thought this was a community where people supported each other," Marcus said evenly. "If that's not the case, it won't be because of me." Howard didn't respond, but his silence was telling. He turned abruptly and stormed back to his house, slamming the door behind him. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of relief and frustration settling over him. This wasn't the end, he could feel it. But as he turned back to his car, he resolved not to let Howard or anyone else strip him of his right to belong. In the stillness that followed, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The section concludes with a clear confrontation and a resolution that satisfies immediate tensions but hints at deeper conflicts yet to be explored, keeping readers engaged for the next installment. The HOA meeting was called on short notice, a rarity that sparked murmurs throughout the neighborhood. Residents filed into the community center, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. At the front of the room stood Mr. Caldwell, clipboard in hand, flanked by Howard and Marcus. The tension between the two men was palpable, like a storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. Howard sat with his arms crossed, a smug grin playing on his lips. He had spent the past few days rallying support from his neighbors, painting Marcus as a disruptive newcomer intent on disregarding the HOA's cherished rules. For his part, Marcus remained calm, his face betraying no sign of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Caldwell cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "Today, we're addressing a complaint regarding alleged violations of HOA guidelines. Mr. Reeves has raised concerns about Mr. Carter's activities, and I've conducted a thorough review of the matter." Howard leaned forward, his grin widening as he anticipated vindication. "Before we proceed," Caldwell continued, "it's important to note that this is not an opportunity for personal attacks. We're here to ensure our community remains harmonious and inclusive." His gaze lingered on Howard for a moment before shifting to the gathered residents. Howard stood abruptly, interrupting Caldwell. "With all due respect, this isn't about personal attacks. It's about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood. Mr. Carter has been blatantly disregarding our rules, and if we let this slide, where does it end?" Several residents exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing with Howard's vehemence. Marcus rose to his feet, his voice steady but firm. "I'd like to address these accusations directly," he said. "Since moving here, I've made every effort to follow the HOA guidelines. I even reached out to Mr. Reeves to introduce myself and ensure there were no misunderstandings about my intentions as a homeowner. Unfortunately, that effort wasn't reciprocated." Howard scoffed, but Marcus continued, undeterred. "I've done nothing to violate the rules. The complaint against me isn't about my actions. It's about who I am, and that's something no one should have to defend." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words settling over the crowd. Caldwell nodded, his expression one of quiet approval. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Now, let's review the findings of my investigation." He flipped through his clipboard, his tone professional. "First, I found no evidence of violations on Mr. Carter's property. His activities are fully compliant with HOA guidelines." However, Caldwell paused, his gaze shifting to Howard. This investigation uncovered a number of unresolved violations on Mr. Reeves's property. Howard's smug expression faltered. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, his voice calm but resolute. "You've made unapproved modifications to your backyard structure. Your fence height exceeds the permitted limit, and your holiday lighting has remained up well past the allowed time frame." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Howard's face turned crimson as murmurs of disapproval rose from the crowd. "This is outrageous," Howard blustered. "You're deflecting from the real issue here." "The real issue," Caldwell interrupted, his voice firm, "is ensuring fairness and accountability. Rules apply to everyone, Mr. Reeves, not just those you choose to target. The residents nodded, their initial skepticism of Marcus replaced by a growing awareness of Howard's hypocrisy. As the meeting progressed, neighbors began to speak up in support of Marcus. One woman, who introduced herself as Karen Gwynn, admitted she had initially harbored doubts about Marcus but had come to see him as a respectful and considerate neighbor. Another resident, an older man named Mr. Patel, added that Howard had a history of filing baseless complaints to assert control over the community. Howard slumped in his chair, his indignation slowly replaced by a creeping sense of defeat. Toward the end of the meeting, Marcus addressed the room once more. "I didn't come here to cause division," he said. "I moved here because I believed this was a place where people cared about each other. I hope we can work toward building a community that welcomes everyone, no matter where they come from." The crowd applauded, a gesture that felt both cathartic and affirming. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The tension he had carried since moving in began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. He had stood his ground, and for the first time it felt like the neighborhood was beginning to see him for who he truly was. From the shadows, Howard watched him leave, his expression unreadable. Whether his defeat would lead to reflection or retaliation remained uncertain. For Marcus, the path ahead wasn't entirely clear, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let anyone dictate his worth or his place in the community. This section introduces a pivotal twist that shifts the balance of power, leaving readers eager to discover how the aftermath unfolds in the final segment. The days following the HOA meeting brought a quiet but palpable shift to Maplewood Avenue. The neighborhood, once bound by unspoken hierarchies and guarded pleasantries, seemed to awaken to the cracks in its facade. Conversations became more genuine, nods of acknowledgement warmer, and the ever-watchful presence of Howard Reeves less oppressive. Marcus returned to his daily routines, his interactions with neighbors growing more frequent and positive. Mrs. Nguyen from across the street brought over a plate of homemade spring rolls as a peace offering. "I'm sorry for not stepping in sooner," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "Howard has always been difficult, but I should have done more to make you feel welcome." Marcus accepted the gesture with a smile. "I appreciate that. Moving somewhere new is always challenging, but I'm glad things are improving." Meanwhile, Howard remained conspicuously absent from his usual post on the porch. Rumors swirled about the hefty fines the HOA had issued for his violations. Some speculated he was too embarrassed to show his face. Others suggested he was stewing, plotting his next move. But Marcus wasn't preoccupied with Howard. He focused on building bridges, starting with an invitation to his neighbors for a small cookout. On a breezy Saturday afternoon, the smell of grilled burgers and sizzling vegetables filled the air. Families gathered in Marcus's backyard, sharing laughter and stories under the shade of a towering oak tree. As the evening wore on, Mr. Patel pulled Marcus aside. "You've done something remarkable, my boy," he said, his weathered face lit by the glow of string lights. "You've reminded this neighborhood what it means to be a community. It's not about rules or appearances. It's about connection." Marcus nodded, humbled by the words. For the first time since moving in, he felt not just accepted, but truly part of something. The following Monday, Howard finally emerged. His demeanor was subdued, his usual bluster replaced by an awkward hesitancy. He approached Marcus, who was watering the flowers lining his driveway. "Morning," Howard began, clearing his throat. Marcus turned, surprised to see him. "Morning, Howard." Howard shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I wanted to apologize," he said, the words seeming foreign on his tongue. "I may have overreacted. I let my concerns get the better of me." Marcus studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. "I appreciate that," he said finally, "but an apology only matters if it's followed by change." Howard nodded, looking down at his shoes. "You're right. I'll work on that." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus to wonder if the moment marked a genuine step forward or simply an attempt to save face. In the days that followed, Howard's behavior softened. He began greeting neighbors with tentative waves and even participated in community events, something he had avoided in the past. While not everyone was quick to forgive, the shift didn't go unnoticed. For Marcus, the experience was a testament to resilience and the power of standing firm in the face of prejudice. He had moved to Maplewood Avenue in search of a home, and though the journey had been fraught with challenges, he had found something deeper, a sense of belonging that couldn't be dictated by rules or bias. As the seasons changed, the neighborhood continued to grow, its once rigid boundaries softening. Marcus's Mustang became a familiar sight, its polished exterior a symbol of pride and perseverance. And while Howard's watchful gaze still occasionally lingered, it lacked the edge of animosity it once held. On one particularly sunny afternoon, Marcus sat on his porch, sipping lemonade as he watched children play in the cul-de-sac. Mrs. Nguyen waved from her garden, and Mr. Patel gave a thumbs up as he passed by on his evening walk. The community, once fractured, was slowly knitting itself back together. Marcus smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift. This was the home he had envisioned, a place where differences could coexist, where growth was possible, and where everyone had a right to belong. The Mustang gleamed in the driveway, its reflection catching the light as a gentle breeze carried the sounds of laughter and life through the neighborhood. And for Marcus, that was enough. This section concludes the story with a sense of closure and optimism, showcasing justice, growth, and the possibility of redemption. It leaves readers with a satisfying resolution while encouraging reflection on the themes of community and inclusion.